Miss Marple and the Laundry That Never Came Back. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like silk in the moonlight. I'm your host Connor, and tonight we follow the keen observations of Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzle that begins with something as simple as missing laundry. Sometimes the most ordinary things hide the most extraordinary secrets. So settle in with something warm to drink, and let us begin this tale of switched linens and hidden messages. Chapter 1. The Scent of Bleach and Lavender. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows between St. Mary Mead and Little Wickham like a gossamer shroud, reluctant to yield to the pale October sun. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her woolen shawl and peered through the window of the village bus as it wound its way along the familiar country lane. She was returning from her weekly visit to her great-niece Diana, a pleasant ritual that had become rather more necessary since Diana's husband had taken ill. It was Mrs. Dollop, the baker's wife, who first mentioned the peculiar business about young Tommy Fletcher. Miss Marple had stopped at the bakery to collect her usual brown loaf when Mrs. Dollop leaned across the counter with that particular expression that indicated village gossip of the most intriguing variety. "Dreadful thing about the Fletcher boy," Mrs. Dollop announced, her flour-dusted hands clasped dramatically to her ample bosom. "Found unconscious behind Hartwell's butcher shop in Little Wickham, he was. Dr. Haydock says he's coming round nicely, but the poor lad can't remember a thing about what happened." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. Pemberton's establishment, cycling between the villages with his cargo of freshly cleaned linens balanced precariously in the large wicker basket mounted on his bicycle. "How very disturbing," Miss Marple murmured, accepting her change. "I do hope the boy wasn't seriously injured. Was anything taken?" Mrs. Dollop's expression grew even more conspiratorial. "That's just it, Miss Marple. His bicycle was found nearby, undamaged, and his wallet was still in his pocket. But the entire delivery of laundry he was carrying has vanished completely." Mrs. Pemberton is beside herself. It represented nearly 2 days' worth of work for some of her best customers. Miss Marple made her way home thoughtfully, her mind turning over this curious incident. In her experience, when something appeared to make no sense at all, it usually made perfect sense to someone. One simply had to discover who that someone might be, and why. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to her cottage door, his expression bearing that familiar mixture of official duty and barely concealed hope that Miss Marple might provide some insight into his current puzzlement. "I don't suppose you've heard about this business with the Fletcher boy," he began without preamble, settling his considerable bulk into Miss Marple's second-best armchair. "Indeed I have, Inspector. Most distressing. I trust Tommy is recovering well." "Physically, yes. Dr. Haydock says there's no sign of serious injury. Appears he was knocked unconscious by a blow to the head, but nothing life-threatening. The problem is, the lad remembers absolutely nothing about the attack. One moment he was cycling toward Little Wickham with Mrs. Pemberton's delivery. The next thing he knew, he was waking up in Dr. Haydock's surgery with a splitting headache." Miss Marple poured tea and settled herself attentively. "And the missing laundry vanished completely. We've searched the entire area where Tommy was found, questioned everyone in Little Wickham, but not so much as a handkerchief has turned up. Mrs. Pemberton has provided us with a complete list of what was taken: bed linens, tablecloths, personal garments belonging to half the gentry in both villages." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "How very peculiar. One would think that stealing laundry would be rather impractical. Surely such items would be easily recognized by their rightful owners." Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. "That's what has me puzzled, Miss Marple. What earthly use would anyone have for a basketful of other people's clean washing? It's not as if you could sell such things without raising suspicions." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Unless, of course, the purpose wasn't to sell them at all. Tell me, Inspector, did Tommy recall anything at all about his attacker? Any detail, however small?" "Only one thing, and it's precious little help. He says he remembers a smell, bleach and lavender, strong enough to notice even with his head reeling from the blow." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bleach and lavender, how very specific, and how very professional. professional. Well, Inspector, consider the combination. Bleach for removing stains and disinfecting lavender for pleasant fragrance, rather the sort of scents one might associate with someone in the cleaning business, wouldn't you say? Inspector Slack made a note in his book, though his expression suggested he found this observation less illuminating than Miss Marple clearly did. I suppose you might be right, though that doesn't narrow things down much. Half the women in both villages use bleach and lavender in their washing. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple found herself drawn to her kitchen window, which provided an excellent view of the lane leading toward Little Wickham. The morning was clear now, with that crisp quality that October days sometimes possessed, and she could see Mrs. Pemberton's laundry van making its rounds in the distance. Something about this entire affair struck her as wrong in a way that went beyond simple theft. In all her years of observing human nature in its various manifestations, she had learned that crimes, like everything else, followed certain patterns. Theft of clothing usually fell into predictable categories: desperate poverty, opportunistic grabbing of valuable items, or occasionally the work of someone with particular inclinations. But the systematic removal of an entire laundry delivery suggested something quite different. Someone had specifically targeted Tommy Fletcher's route, had known exactly what he would be carrying, and had taken considerable risk to acquire those particular items. The question was why. Miss Marple collected her handbag and light coat. She felt a sudden desire to pay a visit to Mrs. Pemberton's establishment and perhaps have a closer look at exactly what sort of laundry had gone missing. In her experience, the devil was very often in the details, and in this case she suspected those details might be found in the precise nature of what someone had been so desperate to steal. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as she made her way toward the village centre, her mind already busy with possibilities that seemed to grow more intriguing with each step. Chapter 2. The Duplicate Deception. Mrs. Pemberton's laundry occupied a converted barn behind the post office, its interior filled with the comfortable sounds of industry, the rhythmic thump of washing machines, the gentle hiss of steam irons, and the soft conversations of the women who worked there. Miss Marple found the proprietress in her small office, surrounded by account books and delivery schedules, her usually cheerful demeanor clouded with worry. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Mrs. Pemberton said, rising from her desk. "I don't suppose you've heard anything about our missing delivery. I've been half out of my mind with worry, not just about poor Tommy, but about what I'm going to tell my customers." "Indeed, it must be most distressing," Miss Marple replied sympathetically. "I was hoping you might allow me to see the list of missing items. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can spot patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed." Mrs. Pemberton produced a carefully handwritten inventory, her neat script documenting each missing piece with methodical precision. "I keep meticulous records, you understand. Mrs. Cadwallader's Egyptian cotton sheets, Colonel Bantry's dress shirts, Lady Ashford's table linens for her dinner party next week." Miss Marple studied the list with growing interest. "This represents quite a valuable collection of items. I notice many of them belong to the most prominent families in the area." "Oh yes, those were my best customers. That's what makes this so terrible. These aren't people who will simply overlook the loss of their finest linens." Mrs. Pemberton's voice quavered slightly. "Some of these pieces are irreplaceable. Mrs. Cadwallader's sheets, for instance, were monogrammed with her family crest. They've been in her family for generations." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Monogrammed, you say? How many of the missing items bore personal markings?" Mrs. Pemberton consulted her list. "Quite a few, actually. The sheets, several of the tablecloths, even some of the gentlemen's shirts. I do a great deal of monogramming work. It's rather a specialty of mine." It was at this moment that young Bessie Hartwell burst through the office door, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. Bessie worked part-time at the laundry when she wasn't helping in her father's butcher shop, and she had clearly run some distance to deliver her news. "Mrs. Pemberton," she gasped, "you'll never guess what's happened. Mrs. Cadwallader's just been on the telephone to father's shop, absolutely furious. She says her laundry was delivered this morning as usual, but something's not right about it." Miss Marple and Mrs. Pemberton exchanged startled glances. "Delivered?" Mrs. Pemberton echoed. "But that's impossible. The entire delivery was stolen. That's just it, Bessie continued, catching her breath. She says the sheets look exactly like hers. Same monogram, same Egyptian cotton, but they don't smell right. Says they've got a strange chemical odor, and the fabric feels different somehow. Miss Marple felt that familiar tingle of excitement that always accompanied a significant breakthrough. Bessie, my dear, did Mrs. Cadwallader say anything else about these supposedly returned sheets? She wants to know if we used a different soap or starch. Says the whole set feels wrong, even though it looks perfect. Bessie paused, frowning. Oh, and she mentioned one other thing. There's a monogrammed pillowcase missing from the set. The one with the family motto embroidered beneath the crest. Mrs. Pemberton looked bewildered, but I distinctly remember including that pillowcase. I checked the entire order twice before Tommy left with it. Miss Marple was already reaching for her handbag. Mrs. Pemberton, I think we should pay Mrs. Cadwallader a visit immediately. If I'm not mistaken, we're dealing with something far more sophisticated than simple theft. The drive to Mrs. Cadwallader's substantial Georgian house provided Miss Marple with time to consider the implications of what they had learned. Someone had not merely stolen the laundry, they had replaced it with exact duplicates, save for one missing piece. This suggested a level of planning and expertise that elevated the crime from opportunistic theft to something approaching industrial espionage. Mrs. Cadwallader met them at the door, a formidable woman in her 70s whose aristocratic bearing was enhanced rather than diminished by her obvious indignation. Mrs. Pemberton, I'm delighted you've come. Perhaps you can explain what's happened to my sheets. She led them to her bedroom, where the disputed linens were displayed across the four-poster bed. To Miss Marple's untrained eye, they appeared perfectly normal, crisp white Egyptian cotton with an elaborate monogram featuring the Cadwallader family crest. They look identical to your usual work, Mrs. Pemberton, Mrs. Cadwallader said, but the smell is all wrong, chemical, somehow, and the cotton feels. She paused, searching for the right word, newer, less lived in, if you understand me. Miss Marple moved closer to examine the sheets, her keen senses confirming Mrs. Cadwallader's observations. There was indeed a faint chemical odor, not unpleasant but distinctly artificial. More intriguingly, when she ran her fingers across the monogrammed crest, she could detect subtle differences in the stitching. Mrs. Cadwallader, she said carefully, you mentioned a missing pillowcase. Could you describe it precisely? It's the one with the family motto Veritas Vincit, embroidered in gold thread beneath the main crest. I always place it at the foot of the bed as a decorative accent. The entire set is meaningless without it. Mrs. Pemberton was examining the sheets with growing bewilderment. The monogramming is perfect. I couldn't have done better work myself. But you're right about the fabric. This cotton has been treated with something to give it an aged appearance, but it's definitely new. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create perfect duplicates of Mrs. Cadwallader's sheets. Someone with access to identical fabric, professional embroidery equipment, and detailed knowledge of the original pieces. But they had deliberately omitted one specific item. Mrs. Cadwallader, she said, might I ask about the family motto on that missing pillowcase? Veritas Vincit, truth conquers. Is there any particular significance to that phrase in your family's history? Mrs. Cadwallader's expression grew thoughtful. Well, it was chosen by my great-grandfather during his time as a magistrate. He was quite famous for his integrity, never accepted a bribe, never let social position influence his judgments, rather made him unpopular in certain circles, but he was very proud of his reputation for absolute honesty. Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Someone had needed that specific pillowcase, not for its value but for its message, and they had been willing to orchestrate an elaborate deception to obtain it without raising immediate suspicion. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple found herself wondering what secret message might be hidden in the gold thread of that missing motto, and what truth someone was so desperate to communicate that they would risk assault and theft to obtain their canvas. Chapter 3, Threads of Evidence. The morning following their visit to Mrs. Cadwallader brought unexpected developments. Miss Marple had just finished her breakfast when Dr. Haydock arrived at her cottage, his medical bag in one hand and a puzzled expression on his weathered face. Jane,
I wonder if I might have a word about young Tommy Fletcher. Something rather odd has come up during his recovery." Miss Marple ushered him into her sitting room and prepared tea while he settled himself in the chair that had become his customary place during their various consultations over village mysteries. "Tommy's memory is beginning to return," Dr. Haydock continued, though in fragments rather than a complete picture. "He's recalled something that might interest you, and Inspector Slack when I can locate that worthy gentleman." "Indeed, what sort of something?" "Well, he remembers more about the attack now. Says he was approached by a woman just as he was entering Little Wickham. She told him there had been a change in the delivery instructions, that he should take the laundry to a different address, a cottage on Elm Lane rather than the usual round of houses." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "A woman? Did he provide any description?" "Middle-aged, well-dressed, with an authoritative manner that made him trust her implicitly. She showed him what appeared to be a note from Mrs. Pemberton authorizing the change. Tommy says he didn't question it. The woman seemed to know all about the delivery, even mentioned specific customers by name." "How very interesting. And this cottage on Elm Lane?" Dr. Haydock's expression grew more puzzled. "That's where it gets strange." Tommy followed the woman's directions and found the cottage easily enough. A neat little place with a well-tended garden. But when he knocked at the door to make the delivery, no one answered. He was standing there uncertain what to do, when someone struck him from behind. Miss Marple set down her cup with great care. "Did he see the person who attacked him?" "No, but he remembers the smell more clearly now. Not just bleach and lavender, but something else. Starch, he thinks, and perhaps soap, like someone who spent their days doing laundry professionally." After Dr. Haydock departed, Miss Marple found herself drawn to investigate Elm Lane for herself. The cottage Tommy had described was indeed as neat as he had remembered. A traditional stone building with a thatched roof and carefully maintained garden. What struck Miss Marple immediately, however, was the complete absence of any signs of habitation. The windows were clean but curtainless, the garden recently tended but showing no evidence of daily use. Most tellingly, there was no smoke from the chimney despite the October chill, and no milk bottles or other deliveries at the door. She was examining the front gate when Mrs. Trent from the neighboring cottage emerged to tend her roses. Mrs. Trent was a gregarious soul who kept careful watch over the comings and goings in her area, exactly the sort of person Miss Marple hoped to encounter. "Good morning, Mrs. Trent. I was admiring this charming cottage. Has it been occupied recently?" Mrs. Trent looked up from her pruning with evident pleasure at having someone to chat with. "Oh, that's been empty for months, Miss Marple. The owner lives in London and only uses it for occasional holidays. Though come to think of it, I did see some activity there recently." "Indeed, what sort of activity?" "Well, just yesterday morning there was quite a bit of bustle. A woman arrived with several large hampers, spent most of the day inside, then left again in the evening. I assumed she was the cleaning lady preparing the place for the owner's arrival." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Did you happen to notice anything about this woman? Her appearance perhaps, or the nature of her work?" Mrs. Trent considered this carefully. "Middle-aged, I'd say, and very purposeful in her movements. She had the look of someone who knew her business. Reminded me of Mrs. Pemberton actually, the way she handled those hampers with such professional efficiency. And the hampers themselves, large wicker ones, the sort laundresses use for bulk delivery. She made several trips to and from her motor car, loading and unloading. Quite energetic for a woman of her age." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Trent and made her way thoughtfully back toward the village centre. The picture that was emerging suggested a carefully orchestrated plan involving someone with intimate knowledge of the local laundry business and access to professional equipment and facilities. She was passing the village green when she encountered Inspector Slack emerging from the post office, his expression even more perplexed than usual. "Miss Marple, just the person I was hoping to see. We've had another development in the Fletcher case that defies all logical explanation." "Indeed, Inspector. Mrs. Ashford has just reported that her table linens were returned this morning, the same ones that were supposedly stolen from Tommy's delivery. Like Mrs. Cadwallader's sheets, they appear to be perfect duplicates of the originals, but they're definitely not the same pieces." Miss Marple nodded. "I suspect we'll find that all the stolen items are being returned as duplicates, Inspector, all except one." "What makes you say that?" "Because I believe someone needed just one specific piece from that delivery. something that couldn't be duplicated, because its value lay not in its appearance but in its history. Everything else had to be replaced to avoid immediate detection of the theft. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Well, you may be right. Mrs. Ashford mentioned that one item is definitely missing from her set is a small napkin with some sort of embroidered design. She says it's been in her family for years, though she couldn't immediately recall its significance. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle beginning to resolve itself. Inspector, I think we need to speak with Mrs. Ashford about that missing napkin, and perhaps we should also investigate who might have access to the equipment and skills necessary to create such perfect duplicates of monogrammed linens. As they walked toward Mrs. Ashford's house, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the missing pillowcase with its embroidered motto, Veritas Vincit, Truth Conquers, combined with a missing napkin bearing some sort of significant embroidered design. She was beginning to suspect that someone was collecting pieces that contained hidden messages, communications embedded in the decorative stitching that only certain people would know how to read. The question was what truth was trying to conquer, and why someone would risk so much to ensure its message was heard. Chapter 4, Messages in Gold Thread. Mrs. Ashford received them in her morning room, a cheerful space overlooking her prized rose garden. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the sort of precise manner that suggested a lifetime of careful attention to detail, exactly the sort of person who would notice subtle differences in familiar household items. Inspector, Miss Marple, I'm so pleased you've come. This business with the table linens has me quite unsettled. They look perfect, you understand, but they're definitely not mine. She led them to her dining room, where the returned linens were displayed across the mahogany table. Miss Marple examined them with the same careful attention she had given to Mrs. Cadwallader's sheets, noting the same chemical odor and subtle differences in fabric texture. You mentioned a missing napkin, Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple said gently. Could you describe it for us? Mrs. Ashford's expression grew thoughtful. It's been in my late husband's family for generations. Small, delicate work, with what appears to be a decorative border of flowers embroidered in gold thread. But Gerald, my husband, always insisted there was more to it than mere decoration. More to it in what way? He claimed his grandmother had told him it contained a family secret, something important that had been preserved in the stitching. I confess I always thought it was just family folklore, but Gerald took it quite seriously. He kept that napkin in his study safe, separate from the other linens. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes. Mrs. Ashford, what was your husband's profession? He was a solicitor, Inspector, quite prominent in his day, with a practice that specialized in estate work for the older families in the area. He handled wills and family trusts for people like the Cadwalladers, the Bantrys, several others. Miss Marple felt another piece click into place. Mrs. Ashford, did your husband ever mention anything about codes or hidden messages in his work? Perhaps something relating to the protection of sensitive information? Mrs. Ashford looked surprised. How extraordinary that you should ask. Yes, Gerald was quite fascinated by the old ways of concealing information. He often spoke about how families in previous centuries would hide important details in seemingly innocent places, needlework, paintings, even the bindings of books, and he believed your family napkin contained such a hidden message. He was convinced of it. He spent hours studying the embroidered pattern with a magnifying glass, trying to decode what he believed was there. He said the arrangement of the flowers wasn't random, that they formed a pattern that corresponded to letters or numbers. Inspector Slack was taking notes rapidly. Did he ever succeed in decoding this supposed message? Not that I know of. He was still working on it when he passed away last spring. Mrs. Ashford paused, then added quietly, though just before his death, he did mention that he thought he was close to solving it. He seemed quite excited about something, but he died before he could share his discovery. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. Gerald Ashford's death had been attributed to natural causes, a heart attack brought on by the stresses of a demanding legal practice, but the timing now seemed suspiciously convenient. Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple said carefully, did your husband mention his work on the napkin to anyone else? Perhaps a colleague or client who shared his interest in historical puzzles? Well, he did sometimes discuss his hobby with other members of the local history society. Let me think. There was Mrs. Pemberton, of course, who's quite knowledgeable about traditional needlework, and that nice woman who runs the cleaning service in Little Wickham, Mrs. Hartwell, I believe. She's supposedly an expert on textile preservation. Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. Mrs. Hartwell from Little Wickham, the mother of young Bessie, who works at Mrs. Pemberton's laundry. That's right. Gerald consulted her several times about the proper care of antique linens. She has quite a reputation for her knowledge of historical textile techniques. After leaving Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack walked in thoughtful silence toward the village centre. The investigation was taking on a complexity that extended far beyond simple theft, involving historical secrets, professional expertise, and what appeared to be a network of individuals with specialized knowledge of textile work and local family histories. Inspector, Miss Marple said eventually, I think we need to learn more about Mrs. Hartwell's cleaning service, and perhaps we should also investigate the circumstances surrounding Gerald Ashford's death more thoroughly. You think his heart attack wasn't natural? I think, Inspector, that someone has been very systematically collecting pieces of antique needlework that contain hidden messages. First Mrs. Cadwallader's pillowcase with its family motto, now Mrs. Ashford's napkin with its coded floral pattern. Someone with the expertise to create perfect duplicates to mask the theft. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. And you suspect Mrs. Hartwell? I suspect someone with professional knowledge of textile work, access to the right equipment and materials, and detailed information about which families owned items containing hidden messages. Mrs. Hartwell appears to meet all those criteria. They had reached the village green when young Bessie Hartwell came cycling toward them, her face flushed with the exertion of her ride from Little Wickham. She dismounted near the post office and approached them with obvious relief. Inspector, Miss Marple, I'm so glad I found you. Something's happened at Mother's shop that I think you should know about. What sort of something, my dear? Miss Marple asked gently. Mother's been acting very strangely the past few days. She's been working at all hours, using equipment I've never seen before, these special embroidery machines and dyes that she claims are for a rush order. But when I asked her about it, she became quite sharp with me, told me it was none of my concern. Bessie looked around nervously before continuing. And this morning, I found something hidden in her workroom. A basket full of linens that don't belong to any of our regular customers. Beautiful pieces with elaborate monogramming and embroidery. When I asked her about them, she said they were samples for a new service she was developing. Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with Inspector Slack. Bessie, my dear, I wonder if you might show us these samples. I'm quite interested in traditional needlework, and I'd love to see examples of your mother's craftsmanship. Bessie hesitated. I'm not sure Mother would approve. She's been very secretive about this new project. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, we could visit when your mother is out. I promise we won't disturb anything. We're simply curious about the techniques involved in reproducing historical embroidery patterns. As they made arrangements to visit Mrs. Hartwell's workshop, Miss Marple found herself wondering what messages were hidden in the gold thread of those stolen pieces, and what truth someone was so desperate to conceal that they would risk multiple crimes to keep it buried. Chapter 5. The Morse Code Pillow. The visit to Mrs. Hartwell's cleaning establishment in Little Wickham proved more revealing than Miss Marple had dared hope. Bessie led them through the main service area, where the ordinary business of commercial laundry proceeded under the supervision of two elderly assistants, into a back room that had clearly been converted into a specialized workshop. The space was equipped with professional embroidery machines, fabric dyes, and pressing equipment that would have been the envy of any commercial textile operation. More intriguingly, scattered across several work tables were examples of needlework in various stages of completion, some clearly new reproductions, others bearing the unmistakable patina of age. Mother says she's developing a service for restoring damaged antique linens, Bessie explained, though her tone suggested she had doubts about this explanation. She's been working on these pieces for weeks, sometimes staying up all night to finish them.
Inspector Slack examined several of the completed pieces with obvious interest. These are remarkable reproductions. I'd have difficulty distinguishing them from genuine antiques. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had been drawn to a particular item partially hidden beneath a cloth covering. When she lifted the fabric, she revealed a pillowcase, bearing the Cadwallader family crest, unmistakably the missing piece from Mrs. Cadwallader's set. "Bessie," she said carefully, "did your mother mention where this pillowcase came from?" Bessie approached and examined the piece with growing concern. "I've never seen this before. Mother certainly didn't tell me she was working on anything for the Cadwalladers." Miss Marple studied the pillowcase more closely, paying particular attention to the embroidered motto beneath the family crest. Veritas Vincit was indeed rendered in gold thread, but as she examined the stitching pattern, she noticed something that made her reach for a magnifying glass. "Inspector, would you look at this? The arrangement of the stitches in this motto doesn't follow a normal embroidery pattern. See how some letters are formed with long stitches, others with short ones." Inspector Slack leaned closer. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that someone has encoded a message using Morse code, substituting embroidery stitches for dots and dashes, long stitches for dashes, short ones for dots." Bessie looked puzzled. Morse code. But why would anyone put Morse code in embroidery? Miss Marple was already transcribing the pattern of stitches onto a piece of paper. "During the war, my dear, many people learned Morse code for emergency communications. It would be a clever way to hide a message in plain sight. Anyone looking at this would see only decorative needlework, unless they knew to look for the code." Working carefully through the pattern, Miss Marple began to decode the hidden message. The long and short stitches gradually resolved into letters HELPTRAPPEDWITNESS. "Help trapped witness," she read aloud. "Bessie, this isn't a family motto at all. It's a desperate plea for assistance." Inspector Slack was making rapid notes. But who would be sending such a message, and why embed it in Mrs. Cadwallader's pillowcase? Miss Marple set down her magnifying glass with a troubled expression. "Inspector, I'm beginning to suspect that someone has been using their access to these families' linens to send coded messages. Someone who knew these items would be collected and examined by the right person." "You mean Mrs. Hartwell, or someone working with her?" Consider the pattern. Gerald Ashford was researching hidden messages in antique needlework when he died suddenly. Mrs. Cadwallader's pillowcase contains a coded plea for help. Mrs. Ashford's napkin supposedly contained a family secret that Gerald was close to decoding. Bessie had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Are you saying my mother is involved in something criminal?" Miss Marple's expression was gentle but serious. "I'm afraid it appears that way, my dear. Someone with access to these families' private linens has been using them to send and receive coded messages. The laundry delivery system provided the perfect cover. Who would suspect that clean sheets and pillowcases might contain hidden communications?" They were interrupted by the sound of a motor car pulling up outside the shop. Through the window they could see Mrs. Hartwell returning from what appeared to be a delivery run, several empty hampers stacked in the back of her vehicle. "We should leave," Bessie whispered urgently. "Mother doesn't like people in her workshop without permission." But Miss Marple was already examining another piece that had caught her attention, a small napkin with an elaborate floral border embroidered in gold thread. "Inspector, this must be Mrs. Ashford's missing napkin. And look, the flowers aren't arranged randomly at all. The pattern was indeed systematic, with different types of flowers positioned according to what appeared to be a deliberate code." Miss Marple quickly sketched the arrangement, noting how roses alternated with daisies and forget-me-nots in a sequence that seemed to correspond to letters of the alphabet. "If roses represent one letter, daisies another, and forget-me-nots a third," she murmured, working through the pattern. The message that emerged was chilling in its simplicity. "MURDERED, murdered G.A." Inspector Slack read over her shoulder. "G.A. Gerald Ashford." The sound of footsteps approaching the workshop sent them hurrying toward the back door. As they slipped out into the alley behind the building, Miss Marple reflected on the implications of what they had discovered. Someone had been using the village laundry system to send coded messages about murder, and that someone had been desperate enough to assault young Tommy Fletcher to prevent their communications from being discovered. "Inspector," she said, as they made their way back toward St. Mary Mead, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation with Mrs. Hartwell." but we should also be prepared for the possibility that she's not the mastermind behind this scheme. She may be another victim, forced to participate through threats or blackmail. The afternoon was growing late, and storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching the climax of this peculiar mystery, and she hoped they would be able to unravel the truth before someone else fell victim to whatever conspiracy had already claimed Gerald Ashford's life. Chapter 6. Bleach Cannot Clean Guilt. The following morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage in a state of considerable agitation. He had clearly been up most of the night, his usually neat appearance dishevelled and his manner suggesting a man who had encountered revelations that challenged his understanding of criminal behaviour. "Miss Marple, we need to talk," he announced without preamble, settling heavily into his customary chair. "I've spent the night investigating Mrs. Hartwell's background, and what I've discovered puts this entire case in a very different light." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual calm efficiency, though she could see from the inspector's expression that significant developments had occurred. "Indeed, what have you learned?" "Mrs. Hartwell isn't the criminal mastermind we suspected. She's been a victim herself. It seems she's been receiving threatening letters for months, demanding that she use her cleaning service to facilitate the collection and delivery of specific items. When she refused initially, her workshop was vandalized and her daughter Bessie was followed home from work several times." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "How very distressing. Did she report these incidents to the authorities?" "That's just it. She was specifically warned not to involve the police. The letters made it clear that any attempt to seek help would result in serious harm to Bessie." Mrs. Hartwell felt she had no choice but to comply with the demands. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with obvious frustration. "She's been forced to create duplicate linens to mask the theft of specific items containing coded messages. She admits she knew what she was doing was wrong, but she was terrified for her daughter's safety. And the person making these demands, that's where it gets interesting." Mrs. Hartwell never met her blackmailer face to face. All communications came through anonymous letters, with payments left in predetermined locations. But she did notice one curious detail. The letters always smelled faintly of expensive cologne, the sort worn by someone of considerable means. Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. "Inspector, did Mrs. Hartwell provide any information about who might have known which families possessed items containing coded messages?" "She says the information came with the demands. Whoever was behind this scheme had detailed knowledge of local family histories and which antique linens contained hidden communications. They knew exactly which items to target, and when they would be available for collection through the laundry service." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the village green where the normal routines of country life continued undisturbed. "This suggests someone with intimate access to local society, Inspector. Someone trusted enough to have learned family secrets and knowledgeable enough to understand the historical significance of encoded needlework." "My thoughts exactly. And there's something else. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that the demands always increased after she'd had contact with certain members of the local history society, as if someone was monitoring her conversations and knew when she'd learned about new items of interest." Miss Marple turned back to face the inspector, her expression grave. "I think we need to examine the membership of that society very carefully, Inspector. And perhaps we should also investigate who had access to Gerald Ashford's research before his death." They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find young Tommy Fletcher, looking much recovered from his ordeal but bearing an expression of considerable concern. "Miss Marple, Inspector, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I've remembered something else about the day I was attacked. Something that might be important." Miss Marple invited him in and settled him with a cup of tea while Inspector Slack prepared to take notes. Tommy's colour had returned and his eyes had lost the confused look that had marked his recovery from the head injury. "I've been thinking about that woman who redirected me to Elm Lane," Tommy began. "At the time I accepted her authority without question. She seemed to know all about the delivery, and spoke with such confidence that I never doubted her." "Can you describe her more precisely now?" Inspector Slack asked. "Middle-aged, well-dressed, with greying hair styled in an expensive manner.
But what I remember most clearly now is her voice, educated, refined, with the sort of accent you hear from people who've had expensive schooling, and she wore jewelry, a distinctive brooch on her lapel. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Can you describe this brooch? It was shaped like a butterfly, with what looked like precious stones, rather elaborate for daytime wear, I thought. But then ladies of a certain class often do dress more formally than working folk. Inspector Slack was writing rapidly. Did she give you a name? She said she was Mrs. Ashford's cousin visiting from London, and that there had been a change in the delivery arrangements due to a family emergency. It all sounded perfectly plausible at the time. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. Mrs. Ashford had made no mention of having a cousin visiting, and the timing of this supposed family emergency was suspiciously convenient. Tommy, Miss Marple said gently, when this woman approached you, did you notice anything else about her appearance or manner? Any detail, however small? Tommy considered this carefully. Well, she did seem very familiar with the laundry business. She knew the names of Mrs. Pemberton's regular customers and understood the usual delivery schedule, and now that I think about it, she had very soft hands, not the hands of someone who does physical work. After Tommy departed, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack sat in contemplative silence. The description of the woman who had redirected the laundry delivery painted a picture of someone from the upper levels of local society, someone with education, means and detailed knowledge of village affairs. Inspector, Miss Marple said eventually, I think we need to pay another visit to Mrs. Ashford. But this time we should ask her about family members and close friends who might have had access to her husband's research into coded needlework. You suspect she knows more than she initially revealed. I suspect she may be protecting someone, perhaps without fully understanding the consequences of that protection. The butterfly brooch Tommy described sounds like the sort of distinctive piece that would be remembered by anyone who had seen it before. As they prepared to leave for Mrs. Ashford's house, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging. Someone in the higher echelons of local society had been systematically collecting encoded messages hidden in antique needlework, using blackmail and intimidation to force others to participate in the scheme. The question was whether they were trying to expose old secrets or bury them deeper. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked through the village, and Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching the moment when all the carefully hidden truths would finally be revealed. Like bloodstains that no amount of bleach could completely remove, some secrets had a way of surfacing despite the most determined efforts to wash them away. Chapter 7. The Butterfly Brooch Betrayal. Mrs. Ashford received them in her morning room with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, though Miss Marple noticed a subtle tension in her manner that suggested anxiety beneath her gracious hospitality. The afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminated a collection of family photographs on the mantelpiece, and Miss Marple found her attention drawn to these glimpses into the Ashford family history. Mrs. Ashford, Inspector Slack began diplomatically, we've made some progress in our investigation, but we need to clarify a few details about your husband's research and his contacts within the local history society. Of course, Inspector. I'll help however I can, though I'm afraid Gerald didn't always share the details of his scholarly pursuits with me. Miss Marple was studying one particular photograph, a formal group portrait, that appeared to have been taken at some sort of society function. Several familiar faces were visible among the assembled worthies, including Mrs. Cadwallader and what appeared to be a younger version of Mrs. Ashford herself. This is a lovely photograph, Miss Marple observed. A local history society gathering perhaps. Mrs. Ashford joined her at the mantelpiece. Yes, that was taken at our annual dinner several years ago. Gerald was quite proud of that event. He'd just given a presentation on hidden messages in historical documents. How interesting. I see several people I recognize. Miss Marple paused at one particular figure in the photograph, an elegant woman wearing a distinctive butterfly brooch. Who is this lady? The brooch she's wearing is quite striking. Mrs. Ashford's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. That's my cousin Millicent Ashford Smythe. She was visiting from London at the time. Millicent has always been interested in family history, particularly the more colourful aspects of our various ancestries. Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with obvious interest. Your cousin from London, does she visit often? Not as frequently as she once did. Millicent has rather demanding social obligations in town, but she did come down when Gerald was working on his needlework project. She was quite fascinated by his research into coded messages. Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition that accompanied a significant breakthrough. Mrs. Ashford, was your cousin visiting recently? Perhaps around the time your husband was making his final discoveries about the family napkin. Mrs. Ashford hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously. Well, yes, as a matter of fact. Millicent came down just a week before Gerald's heart attack. She was very interested in his progress and spent hours with him in his study, examining the various pieces he'd collected. Various pieces? Inspector Slack inquired. You mean he had other items containing coded messages? Oh yes. Gerald had been corresponding with several local families about their antique needlework. Mrs. Cadwallader had shown him her pillowcase, and there were others. Millicent was particularly excited about what he'd discovered. She said it had implications that went far beyond simple family history. Miss Marple exchanged a significant glance with Inspector Slack. Mrs. Ashford, might I ask what your cousin's circumstances are in London? Her profession or social connections? Mrs. Ashford looked puzzled by the question. Millicent has always been somewhat mysterious about her affairs. She claims to be involved in historical research for various collectors and museums, but she's never been specific about the details. She does seem to have substantial resources though, expensive clothes, jewelry, that sort of thing. And her interest in your husband's work, did she offer any explanation for her enthusiasm? She said Gerald had stumbled onto something significant, a network of coded communications that dated back generations. She seemed to think it might involve old family secrets that could be valuable to the right collectors. Inspector Slack was taking careful notes. Mrs. Ashford, did your cousin have access to your husband's research materials during her visit? Oh yes, Gerald shared everything with her. They spent entire evenings going through his files and examining the various pieces with magnifying glasses. Millicent even took photographs of some items, saying she wanted to study them more carefully back in London. Miss Marple was beginning to see the full scope of the deception. Mrs. Ashford, I wonder if you might tell us about your husband's death. Was your cousin still visiting when he suffered his heart attack? Mrs. Ashford's expression grew troubled. Actually, that's what's so tragic about the timing. Millicent had left just the day before, after saying she was going to verify some of Gerald's discoveries through her contacts in London. Gerald was so excited about whatever they'd discussed that he stayed up most of that last night, working in his study. When I found him the next morning, she trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Miss Marple noticed that the handkerchief bore delicate embroidery around its edges, the sort of fine needlework that had become central to their investigation. Mrs. Ashford, Miss Marple said gently, did your husband seem distressed at all during your cousin's visit? Worried or anxious about anything? Now that you mention it, yes. Toward the end of Millicent's stay, Gerald seemed quite agitated. He kept muttering about things not being what they seemed and about people using old secrets for modern purposes. I thought it was just scholarly excitement, but perhaps. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Mrs. Ashford, I think we need to have a conversation with your cousin. Do you have contact information for her in London? Mrs. Ashford provided an address in Belgravia and a telephone number, though she mentioned that Millicent was often difficult to reach and frequently travelled for her mysterious research work. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused to examine the family photograph once more. The butterfly brooch worn by Millicent Ashford Smith was indeed distinctive, exactly as Tommy Fletcher had described it. But more importantly, the woman's expression in the photograph suggested someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, regardless of the cost to others. Inspector, Miss Marple said as they walked back toward the village centre, I suspect we'll find that Mrs. Ashford Smith's London address is either false or temporary. Someone sophisticated enough to orchestrate this elaborate scheme would hardly provide genuine contact information. You think she's disappeared? I think she's accomplished what she came for. The collection of coded messages that contained information valuable enough to justify assault, theft and quite possibly murder. The question now is what she plans to do with those secrets, and whether we can stop her before she causes any more harm. The evening shadows were lengthening as they made their way through the village, and Miss Marple sensed that they were racing against time to prevent further tragedy. Like a butterfly that learns briefly before flying away, Millicent Ashford Smith had touched down in their quiet community just long enough to gather what she needed, leaving destruction in her wake. Chapter 8: Lavender and Lies. The telephone call from London came early the next morning, reaching Inspector Slack just as he was preparing to travel to the city to investigate Millicent Ashford Smith's given address. Miss Marple, who had arrived at the police station to discuss their strategy, watched his expression grow increasingly grim as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "I see," he said finally. "Yes, we'll need full details of that investigation. This may be connected to a case we're working on down here." He replaced the receiver and turned to Miss Marple with obvious frustration. "The address Mrs. Ashford gave us for her cousin doesn't exist. The building number she provided would place it in the middle of Hyde Park. More significantly, Scotland Yard has been investigating a series of thefts from wealthy collectors, antique textiles containing historical significance." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I suspected as much. Someone with Mrs. Ashford Smith's apparent sophistication would hardly be operating on a purely local level. Tell me, what sort of thefts has Scotland Yard been investigating?" "Apparently there's been a systematic targeting of items with hidden historical significance, documents concealed in book bindings, maps sewn into tapestries, and yes, coded messages embedded in needlework. The thefts have been remarkably professional, often involving the creation of perfect replicas to mask the fact that originals had been stolen." Inspector Slack consulted his notes from the telephone conversation. "What's particularly interesting is that the thefts appear to be connected to old families with secrets dating back to wartime activities, both the Great War and the more recent conflict. Someone's been collecting evidence of historical indiscretions that could be valuable for blackmail purposes." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. "Inspector, I think we need to examine Gerald Ashford's research more systematically. If he discovered a network of coded communications, he may have inadvertently uncovered secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect." They were interrupted by the arrival of young Bessie Hartwell, who appeared at the police station in a state of considerable distress. Her usual neat appearance was disheveled, and her eyes showed signs of recent tears. "Inspector, Miss Marple, something terrible has happened. Mother's disappeared." Inspector Slack immediately became alert. "Disappeared? When did you last see her?" "Yesterday evening. She said she was going to make a delivery to a special customer, someone who had requested absolute discretion. She took one of her work baskets and said she'd be back by midnight, but she never returned. Her bed hasn't been slept in." Miss Marple guided Bessie to a chair and offered her a cup of tea while Inspector Slack prepared to take a formal statement. "Bessie, dear, did your mother mention anything about this special customer? A name perhaps, or a location?" "She said it was a lady from London who was staying temporarily in the area, someone who needed urgent repair work on a valuable antique piece." Mother seemed nervous about the appointment, but she said the payment offered was too generous to refuse. Inspector Slack exchanged a meaningful glance with Miss Marple. "Bessie, did this lady visit your mother's shop in person, or did she communicate through letters?" Mother said she'd only spoken to her on the telephone. The lady had a very refined accent and seemed to know a great deal about textile restoration. She specifically requested Mother's services because of her reputation for discretion with valuable items. Miss Marple leaned forward with concern. "Did your mother take anything unusual with her for this appointment? Any special equipment or materials?"
Bessie nodded miserably. She took her portable embroidery kit and a selection of gold thread, the expensive kind she uses for the most delicate restoration work. She also took that pillowcase you found in her workshop, the one with the family crest. She said the customer had specifically requested it. The implications of this information sent a chill through Miss Marple. Hartwell had been lured away from her shop with the very item that contained the coded plea for help, presumably by the same person who had orchestrated the entire elaborate scheme. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I fear Mrs. Hartwell has been taken by someone who no longer needs her services and considers her a liability. We must find her quickly." Inspector Slack was already organizing a search effort when Dr. Haydock arrived at the station with news that provided both hope and additional concern. "Inspector, I've just had a call from my colleague in Little Wickham. A woman matching Mrs. Hartwell's description was seen late last night near the old mill on the river. She appeared to be with someone else, though my colleague couldn't make out any details in the darkness. Miss Marple's mind immediately conjured an image of the abandoned mill, an isolated location that would provide perfect privacy for whatever confrontation Mrs. Ashford Smith planned. Inspector, we should search the mill immediately. If Mrs. Hartwell is being held there, time may be running short. As they prepared to leave for the mill, Bessie provided one additional detail that confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears about the situation. Inspector, there's something else. When I was cleaning Mother's workshop this morning, I found a letter hidden beneath some fabric scraps. It was addressed to me, in Mother's handwriting. She produced a sealed envelope with obvious reluctance. I haven't opened it yet, but Mother only writes letters when she thinks something serious might happen to her. Inspector Slack opened the letter carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read the contents aloud. My dear Bessie, if you are reading this, then I have been forced to take action that may place me in danger. I have discovered that the person who has been blackmailing me is not content with theft alone. She has been collecting evidence of old secrets that could destroy several prominent families. I cannot allow this to continue, even if it means risking my own safety. The coded messages I was forced to help steal contain proof of wartime activities that certain people would do anything to keep hidden. I am taking the most important piece to a final confrontation, hoping to end this nightmare once and for all. If something happens to me, please ensure that Inspector Slack knows the truth about what we've discovered. Your loving mother. Miss Marple felt a mixture of admiration and dread as she listened to Mrs. Hartwell's final message. The woman had found the courage to confront her blackmailer despite the obvious danger, but she was facing someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to commit murder to protect her secrets. Inspector, Miss Marple said urgently, we must reach the mill immediately. Mrs. Hartwell may be attempting to negotiate with someone who has no intention of letting her leave alive. As they hurried toward the river, Miss Marple found herself hoping they would arrive in time to prevent another tragedy. The scent of lavender and bleach that had marked this case from the beginning now seemed ominous rather than merely professional. The attempt to wash away evidence that could never be completely cleansed. Chapter 9. Secrets Written in Blood. The old mill stood like a brooding sentinel beside the darkly flowing river, its weathered brick walls and broken windows creating an atmosphere of desolation that seemed to match the gravity of their mission. Inspector Slack had organized his approach carefully, positioning constables around the building's perimeter, while he, Miss Marple, and Dr. Haydock approached the main entrance. The heavy wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Through the gap, they could hear voices from within, one sharp and authoritative, the other pleading and desperate. Miss Marple recognized Mrs. Hartwell's voice immediately, though it was strained with fear and exhaustion. You must understand, Mrs. Hartwell was saying, I never wanted to be part of this deception. You forced me to participate through threats against my daughter. The reply came in the refined tones that Tommy Fletcher had described, cultured, confident and utterly cold. My dear Mrs. Hartwell, you served your purpose admirably, but I'm afraid your usefulness has come to an end. Inspector Slack signaled for his men to be ready as he pushed the door open wider. The interior of the mill had been converted into a makeshift workshop with tables covered in needlework, embroidery equipment, and what appeared to be photographic materials for documenting historical items. Mrs. Hartwell sat bound to a chair in the center of the space, her face pale but determined. Standing over her was a woman who perfectly matched Tommy's description, well-dressed, middle-aged, wearing the distinctive butterfly brooch that had become central to their investigation. Mrs. Millicent Ashford Smith, I presume, Inspector Slack announced, stepping into the mill with his hand on his truncheon. I am Inspector Slack of the local constabulary, and you are under arrest. The woman turned toward them with surprising composure, as if she had been expecting their arrival. Inspector, how delightful. I was just concluding some business with Mrs. Hartwell. I don't suppose you'd care to join our little discussion about the value of discretion. Miss Marple moved closer to examine the materials scattered across the work tables. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions about the scope of the criminal enterprise they had uncovered. "Inspector," she said quietly, "Mrs. Ashford Smith has been running a systematic blackmail operation, using coded messages hidden in antique needlework. These photographs document communications that could destroy the reputations of several prominent families. The evidence was extensive and damning. Photographs of needlework pieces showed coded messages revealing wartime collaborations, financial improprieties, and personal scandals spanning several generations. The Cadwallader pillowcase's plea for help was just one piece in a vast collection of incriminating communications. Rather impressive, isn't it?" Mrs. Ashford Smith said with obvious pride. It took years to identify which families had used needlework to hide their secrets, and months to arrange for the collection of the most valuable pieces. Poor Gerald Ashford was so helpful in mapping out the entire network before he suffered his unfortunate heart attack. Dr. Haydock moved forward to examine Mrs. Hartwell, while Inspector Slack began the formal arrest procedure. "She appears unharmed physically," he reported, though clearly traumatized by her ordeal. Miss Marple continued her examination of the evidence, noting particularly a leather-bound journal that appeared to document Mrs. Ashford Smith's criminal activities in meticulous detail. "Inspector," she said, "this journal contains records going back several years. Mrs. Ashford Smith has been systematically researching historical secrets and using them for blackmail purposes. The deaths attributed to natural causes, Gerald Ashford, possibly others, were likely murders committed to protect this operation." Mrs. Ashford Smith's composure finally cracked slightly. Gerald was becoming inconveniently curious about the commercial applications of his research. He threatened to expose what he called my exploitation of historical trauma. "I simply couldn't allow that to happen." "So you poisoned him," Inspector Slack stated bluntly. "I administered a small dose of digitalis in his evening brandy, quite undetectable in a man with known heart problems. The attack appeared completely natural, and I inherited access to all his research materials through my dear cousin's grief-stricken cooperation." Mrs. Hartwell, now freed from her bonds, struggled to speak through her emotional distress. "She forced me to create duplicates of the stolen pieces to prevent immediate detection of the thefts. She said if I didn't cooperate, she would ensure that Bessie suffered the same fate as Mr. Ashford." Miss Marple felt a deep sadness as she contemplated the full scope of the crimes that had been committed. "Mrs. Ashford Smith, you used people's love for their families as a weapon against them. You corrupted the very symbols of domestic affection: bed linens, tablecloths, personal garments, turning them into instruments of fear and exploitation." "I provided a valuable service," the woman replied with remarkable arrogance. "Historical secrets have commercial value, particularly to collectors who appreciate the intimate details of prominent families' past indiscretions." Inspector Slack was completing the formal arrest when one of his constables discovered additional evidence hidden in the mill's upper level: correspondence with London collectors, payment records for blackmail demands, and detailed plans for expanding the operation to other regions. "The scope of this enterprise is far beyond anything we initially suspected," he told Miss Marple, as Mrs. Ashford Smith was led away in handcuffs. "Scotland Yard will need to coordinate a major investigation into her network of contacts and victims." As they prepared to leave the mill, Mrs. Hartwell approached Miss Marple, with obvious gratitude and relief. "Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough for saving my life and protecting my daughter. I know I did wrong in participating in this deception, but I felt I had no choice." "My dear Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple replied gently, "you showed remarkable courage in confronting Mrs. Ashford Smith, despite the obvious danger. Your determination to protect Bessie and end the blackmail operation demonstrates the very best of human nature." The evening shadows were lengthening as they made their way back toward the village, but Miss Marple felt a sense of closure settling over the strange case of the missing laundry. The truth had finally been revealed, justice would be served, and the victims of Mrs. Ashford Smith's elaborate deception could begin to rebuild their lives. However,
As they walked through the quiet countryside, Miss Marple reflected on the deeper implications of what they had discovered. The case had revealed how easily symbols of domestic security, clean linens, family heirlooms, personal garments could be corrupted by criminal intent, turning the most innocent aspects of daily life into weapons of manipulation and fear. Chapter 10: Truth Conquers All. The morning after Mrs. Ashford Smeathie's arrest dawned clear and bright, with the sort of crisp October air that seemed to promise renewal and fresh beginnings. Miss Marple was taking her customary breakfast when Mrs. Bantry arrived at her cottage, bearing the morning newspaper, and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Jane, my dear, you simply must see this," she announced, spreading the paper across the breakfast table. "The story of your latest triumph has made the London papers. Village sleuth uncovers historical blackmail rings. How very thrilling." Miss Marple glanced at the newspaper with mild interest, though she had never been one to seek publicity for her investigative efforts. "I do hope they've been accurate in their reporting, Dolly. These cases are often more complex than newspaper accounts suggest." Indeed, the complexity of Mrs. Ashford Smeathie's criminal enterprise was still being unravelled by Scotland Yard's investigation. Inspector Slack had received updates throughout the morning, each revelation adding new layers to an already intricate case. The scope of her operation was truly remarkable, he told Miss Marple when he arrived later that morning to provide a final briefing on the case. She had clients throughout Europe who collected what she called historical intimacies, compromising secrets about prominent families that could be used for blackmail or simply for the perverse pleasure of possessing forbidden knowledge. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. "The corruption of scholarship for criminal purposes is particularly distressing. Gerald Ashford's genuine interest in historical communications was perverted into a tool for exploiting human vulnerability." The inspector consulted his notes. Mrs. Ashford Smeathie's confessed to Gerald's murder and admitted to running the blackmail operation for nearly 3 years. She targeted families with wartime secrets, financial indiscretions and personal scandals that had been encoded in needlework for safekeeping. And Mrs. Hartwell's role? She was entirely a victim, forced to participate through threats against her daughter. Her expertise in textile work made her invaluable for creating the duplicate pieces that masked the thefts. Mrs. Ashford Smeathie chose her specifically because she had both the necessary skills and a vulnerable point, her devotion to Bessie. Miss Marple felt a particular satisfaction in learning that Mrs. Hartwell had been cleared of criminal responsibility. The woman's courage in confronting her blackmailer despite obvious danger demonstrated the sort of moral strength that Miss Marple always found inspiring. Dr. Haydock arrived as they were concluding their discussion, bringing news of Tommy Fletcher's complete recovery and an interesting additional detail about the coded messages they had discovered. "I've been working with a colleague who specializes in historical codes," he reported. "The messages we found weren't just random communications, they were part of a systematic record-keeping system used by resistance networks during both World Wars. Families encoded information about safe houses, supply routes and personnel movements in their domestic needlework." Miss Marple's interest was immediately engaged. "You mean these weren't just personal secrets, but historical documents of genuine significance?" "Exactly. Mrs. Cadwallader's Veritas Vincit pillar case, for instance, contained not just a plea for help, but coordinates for a wartime safe house that sheltered dozens of refugees. Mrs. Ashford's napkin documented financial contributions to resistance activities. These pieces are historically valuable in their own right." Inspector Slack looked pleased. So Mrs. Ashford Smeathie wasn't just stealing family secrets, she was looting historical artifacts. Precisely. Scotland Yard is working with historians to identify the full significance of the stolen pieces and ensure they're returned to their proper owners or donated to appropriate museums. As the official participants in the investigation departed, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The case had begun with something as ordinary as missing laundry, and had revealed layers of criminal sophistication that stretched from their quiet country community to the highest levels of London society. She paused at Mrs. Pemberton's laundry establishment, where normal operations had resumed with obvious relief. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Hartwell training a new assistant in proper fabric care techniques, her professional competence restored along with her peace of mind. Young Bessie emerged from the building carrying a delivery basket, her step light and her face bright with the contentment of someone whose world had been restored to order. "Miss Marple," she called out cheerfully, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you did to help Mother and me. We can never repay you for your kindness, my dear child," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Seeing your mother's courage vindicated and your family reunited is reward enough. Sometimes the most important victories are simply the restoration of ordinary happiness." As she continued her walk, Miss Marple reflected on the deeper lessons of the case. Mrs. Ashford Smeathie had attempted to profit from the secrets that families had hidden in their most intimate possessions: bed linens, tablecloths, personal garments that carried the weight of historical necessity and personal shame. But ultimately, truth had indeed conquered, as the motto on Mrs. Cadwalader's pillowcase proclaimed. The coded messages that were meant to hide dangerous information had instead preserved evidence of courage, sacrifice, and moral conviction that spanned generations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green as Miss Marple made her way home, her mind already turning to the simple pleasures of her garden, her knitting, and the quiet observation of human nature in all its complexity. The case of the missing laundry had been resolved, justice had been served, and the ordinary rhythms of village life could resume. Yet she knew that somewhere, in another quiet community, other secrets lay hidden in the fabric of daily life, waiting for the right combination of circumstances and observation to bring them into the light. For Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most extraordinary mysteries often began with the most ordinary events, even something as simple as laundry that never came back. The evening breeze carried the scent of woodsmoke and autumn leaves as she reached her cottage gate, closing the door on another chapter in her ongoing study of the endless fascinating puzzle of human nature. Truth might conquer all, but it often required patient observation and gentle persistence to ensure that justice was served and innocence protected. And in the end, Miss Marple reflected, that was perhaps the most important laundry of all, the careful washing away of deception to reveal the clean truth beneath. And so concludes another mystery from the observant eyes of Miss Jane Marple. Here at Velvet Clues, we've seen how even the most mundane events can conceal extraordinary secrets, and how truth, like a persistent stain, has a way of surfacing despite all attempts to wash it away. Thank you for joining us on this journey through hidden messages and domestic deceptions. Until our next mystery unfolds, this is Connor reminding you that in the world of Miss Marple, nothing is ever quite as simple as it first appears.